Well, good morning. My name is Pierce. I serve as one of the pastors here, and since we talked about Patsy, I've been here just a little under a year and a half, and I remember I hadn't really gotten to know Patsy at all, but I visited her in the hospital over the last couple of months, and I remember the first time I went by myself, and so I had never seen her before, didn't know what she looked like, and showing up to a random hospital room, and I remember I walked in, and she says, "You're the pastor. I've been praying for you." And she asked me how my boys were doing, and I was like, "That's just that meant a lot to me." And so, I didn't get a chance to know her, see her very often, and so, but just church, we do mourn with you and celebrate that and that her life that she did live, and she had a great influence on a lot of us. And so, anyway, again, my name is Pierce, and I served as teacher pastor here, and I've been involved in church for a long time. I gave my life to the Lord when I was 15 years old. I felt calling into ministry when I was a junior in high school, and originally I wanted to go to the military, be a lifer, do that, and then once I felt called in ministry, I kind of combined those things, like, well, I'll become a chaplain, so I had to go to school. And I went to a small Baptist university, so Southwest Baptist University. If you've ever been to a Christian college, you realize they all have the same vibes. And we had chapel twice a week, and where attendance was tracked, and while I was going through school, I was serving as a youth pastor, and then I was working on a factory on the weekends. And just about for 3.5 years, I would go into work about 3 p.m. on a Saturday, get off at 7 a.m. Sunday morning, shower, so about 12 to 16 hours, and then I would wake up Alex, and then we would go serve at church, lead worship, teach Sunday school, go through church, and then power nap, and then work from 1 to 10 that night. And so for about 3.5 years, I got next to no sleep while I was going to school. So, and then I'd have to drive an hour to school the next morning. So when I say I skipped chapel a lot, I skipped chapel a lot because I was dead tired. And but there was a coffee shop there, and I remember this one time, there was a coffee shop named Caldy's, and instead of going there, I reminded myself that Jesus would have been okay if I skipped that day because I was really tired. But I was sitting with some people that I went to school with, and someone was talking about this story where Jesus turned water into wine. Everyone familiar with that story? Well, we're at a Baptist college, and so someone made the joke that if Jesus had been Baptist, he would have turned the wine back into water, okay? Well, I'm glad you guys laughed because one guy didn't, and he informed us that Jesus didn't partake in drinking alcoholic wine, and the wine he did drink was non-alcoholic, essentially grape juice, or 1/34 or 1/39 of the alcoholic content. And you wonder at this time where people would get non-alcoholic wine. And so someone asked him, and he said, "Listen, I don't know, but my Jesus wouldn't drink alcoholic wine." And the discussion was over, and I was left kind of wondering if my Jesus was the same one as his. And let me just be funny here for a second. There's a movie that illustrates this, and this is not a good movie. So, but I was middle schooler when this came out. But it's the Talladega Nights, the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, and in there he's praying. Basically, it's this rags to riches story that he is his crew member, and then he becomes a race car, and he's if you don't share much details, he's thanking God for what he's given him. But this is how he prays. He begins every meal and he says, "Here, dear Lord, baby Jesus, dear tiny Jesus in your golden fleece diapers, you haven't even learned to walk yet." And then his wife will interrupt him and be like, "Hey, sweetie, like Jesus grew up." And he's like, "Well, I like the Christmas Jesus the best. When you say grace, you could pray to grown-up Jesus or teenage Jesus or bearded Jesus." And then he gets interrupted. He's like, "Okay, let me pray. Dear 8-pound, 6-ounce Lord, baby Jesus." Then a friend interrupts him. He says, "I like to picture my Jesus with a tuxedo t-shirt. Because it says, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party." And then I'm not going to continue on because it gets weird real fast. But we're all aware that often people will reinterpret Jesus, that will read Jesus through our own cultural and religious lenses, and not everyone sees Jesus the way we do, but in our heart of hearts, each of us believes that maybe my Jesus is the closest to the real one. And at times, the image of Jesus we do have kind of looks like a buffet table. We go around and we pick and choose from the Gospels, things and aspects we prefer, and like maybe selecting stories from here that resonate with us. I notice Brussels sprouts on the buffet table. I know they're good for me, but I don't like them, so I don't grab them. And sometimes when we look through the different Gospels, you're going to see some different portraits of Jesus portrayed. And the Jesus I envision wouldn't upset anyone unless they're a bad person. You know, he wouldn't impose harsh demands on anybody, but he loves and gives grace. But when it comes down to it, often I want the Jesus that agrees with me, the one that likes what I like and hates what I hate. And, you know, maybe more bluntly, the Jesus I envision often seems I'm concerned about the issues that don't move me either, and passionate about the ones that do. And as much as we would like to think that we have been influenced by how others viewed Jesus before us. And what I love about the Gospels, and as we're about to get into it, is Jesus asks his questions to his followers, his disciples. He asks this question, who do you say that I am? Or who do the people say that I am? And he wasn't just curious about what his followers believed, but he cared about what the people that surrounded heard about him. Because he knows people in the world get their view of Jesus influenced, but then he asked the question, who do you say that I am, to each of his followers? And here's the incredible thing. In our Bibles, what we hold here, we get their response. And the book that we're going to be studying, you know, is Matthew, and it's really one of the most treasured Christian writings for the Christian faith. And there's this quote that I read that says this, that is to no exaggeration to state that the faithful who lived between the end and the first and the second centuries came to know the words and deeds of Christ on the basis of this text. And it's all because Jesus had an influence on a man named Matthew. And so if you have your Bibles, I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. And it's on page 790 in those black pew Bibles in front of you. If you don't have one, that's our gift to you. Take it. We'd love you to follow along with us. And so what we're going to do over the next couple months is we're going to spend our time looking at the story of Matthew. And this morning, what we're going to do is really two things. We're going to look at his gospel, you know, his story, his calling, his response, from how he introduces the stories to how he shares the message he passes on. He purposely pushes us to the feet of Jesus and says, those who have ears, let them hear. But then from the lessons we draw from the text, I want to end our time by looking ahead to this year, both in our lives and for the life of our church. So, everyone with me in Matthew chapter 9? We'll start in verse 9. So as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And we're going to pause and we're going to slowly work through this. And so you have Jesus here. He's in his ministry. It's begun thriving. So in context of this passage in Matthew chapter 3, opposition is brewing. Jesus is spreading, his name is going around. Have you heard about Jesus? Have you heard about Jesus? He's doing all these miracles in the area, but there's opposition and things are raising up that the religious leaders don't like. Because often people don't like to get their worldview rattled and challenged, and primarily when it comes to religious matters, people are like, hey, that's not my religion. Or that's not how my God would do things. And Jesus is going to step on a lot of people's toes here in this passage, and you might ask why. Because of this. It's because Jesus invites Matthew to follow. And you're like, well, isn't that the point of why Jesus came? To invite people to become a disciple of Jesus in an ongoing, intimate relationship. And the answer is yes, that's what Jesus came to do, to invite people in to follow. But here's what we know about Matthew. Matthew's heritage was that of a Jew. But in all reality, he was an outsider, because we're given his vocation as a tax collector. Because at some point in Matthew's life, he sold his soul, in a sense, to the Roman agenda, just said, hey, my life, my identity with my Jewish narrative is done. And by Jewish standards, this is what it means. You're dead to me. And then he switched to Roman standards, and if you know about Roman occupancy and the expansion, it's the rich, it's the powerful, it's the ruthless who will inherit the earth. So Roman was the power in place, and they were oppressing the people of God. And so let's set the stage real quick. Why people are getting their toes stepped on by Jesus by inviting Matthew to follow is because imagine you are working to make ends meet. It's an agricultural society. It takes a village. You're working, you're planning, you're dependent on the harvest to come. And in this balanced ecosystem where everyone's doing their part, you have one of your brothers leave and went to work for the people who are oppressing you. And now imagine, as part of the tax, they would come in and the tax collectors would be escorted by a troop of Roman soldiers. And so you have to stand by and watch as the Roman soldiers and this brother who left you take too much of your harvest as the tax. You and your family will go hungry while he and the Roman soldiers will eat your fill of grain. And so you have Matthew here, despised and hated, best known as his unforgivable past as a tax collector. And Jesus one day walks up to him, walks along the beach, and looks at this guy sitting in the booth, extends an invitation to the story of God, knowing Matthew's story. And what does Matthew do? He says, "Follow me, Matthew." And Matthew got up and followed him. And his whole calling and response was completely out of the ordinary. It required nothing short of a miracle. And what I love about this gospel that we're going to study over the next couple months is you're going to hear stories of all these people who aren't supposed to belong find belonging. You're going to have all these people who shouldn't have any faith in God, and Jesus is going to say, "I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel." And then every time Jesus and the disciples walk into a village or town, they're going to encounter people who know the way of God, who are devoted to obedience. And Jesus is going to say, that's not the obedience God is looking for. And with all the people that are supposed to have it, they don't have it. And everything is going to be backward. And for the people that aren't supposed to have it, Jesus is going to say they do. And here's what's cool. Matthew thought that by walking away from his family story, by walking away and abandoning that, his life was going to be forever out. But you see, in this backwards moment, it's an invitation to step into the story that God has been unfolding since it all began. Through this invitation to follow Jesus. And Jesus says, "Hey, come be one of my disciples. You'll be part of a bigger story that I've been telling. The story that he was told as a child, raised, has now culminated in the person extending the invitation to him." And what's his response to this? Look at verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and the disciples. And so his actions and responses are clear, especially when you look at Luke chapter, I believe it's 5 or 6. But because Jesus invited Matthew to follow him, to come into this ongoing intimate relationship with him, he saw it as an opportunity to invite others in. So you see Jesus invite Matthew to follow. Matthew, in turn of experiencing this from Jesus, says, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite people over to my house." And he says other tax collectors and sinners to come eat with him and the disciples. Because Matthew, for one who knew the pain and heartache of being excluded, goes and finds ones just like him and says, "I have a spot at the table for you. Come with me to be with Jesus." And here's the thing. We don't know the outcome of all these unnamed individuals. We don't know if they followed Jesus from that point on, but they heard and saw in Matthew of what a life could look like because Matthew had a heart for those he walked with. And what you're going to see in Matthew chapter 11 is that Jesus' connections and relationships he makes as he ministers is going to give him the reputation as the friend of tax collectors and sinners. So this is going to upset the religious people who worked tirelessly to communicate social standards and moral values, because in their eyes, Jesus was contaminating the faith, not making it better. Because he befriended sinners and he let them in. So the Pharisees wasted no time. Go on to verse 11. Because when the Pharisees saw this, and they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said, "Is it not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick?" But then as a way to say, hey, go back to school. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And so you have this story that the Pharisees, they would say, hey, my God wouldn't sit with the unclean. My God wouldn't sit with the sinful. He is a holy being. But Jesus quotes the prophet Hosea, who emphasized that God wants compassion and a change of heart from his people, not just outward religious practices. And he turns to the Pharisees and religious leaders and says, this is not what I'm after. I don't want sacrifices. My Father's not pleased with heartless obedience. Because the problem, what we're going to see in the Jews is they followed the sacrificial system, but they mixed worship with idols. They trusted in political alliances. They trusted in what they could do in the kingdom of the earth. And more so, that they mistreated people with lies, theft, and bloodshed, where God instructed them to be compassionate and gracious. And the whole thing with Jesus, with the Pharisees, when he's going on to the whole idea is, how can those who claim faith in God, who have tasted the Lord's goodness in their life and his forgiving grace, look down on or exclude others? And Jesus, in our passage, never denies that the dinner guests are sinners. And Jesus explains using this simple illustration as the healthy who need a doctor, or as the sick who need a doctor. But there's this really important thing that he says. He says, for I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. The idea, he says, hey, this is not who I'm coming for, but I have come for those who are in need of help. That what you see, there's really two things that in this, that Matthew's going to center everything in his gospel on is the first thing, that Jesus has come. The fact that Jesus has stepped onto the scene, that he has come, is what we celebrated at Christmas. Matthew's going to start with the genealogy of Jesus. He's going to say, hey, Emmanuel, God is with us. He stepped out of heaven for us. And because he has done so, he now has this, he surrounds himself with all this merciful crowd who's in need of mercy. That Emmanuel, Jesus, Matthew knows deep in his heart and in his soul that Emmanuel has come to bring messed up, broken, lost causes in. That Jesus' life and mission was to extend this God's mercy to people. And as Jesus is sitting around these tax collectors and these sinners, he knows they can't avoid their own sinfulness. And Matthew has been one of them. But he experienced Jesus' merciful call to salvation. So now he brings his friends, marginalized and forgotten, to the feet of Jesus. He says, let them, if you have ears, hear about the goodness that he has for you. That he wanted for them to find the same healing for their souls. And so Jesus provides the example for Matthew to follow. Now that God has come near in Jesus and he's invited you to follow Matthew, now the second thing that he's going to tie together in this whole book is now go and play your part. And we call it the Great Commission. And here's how he ends the gospel, from the genealogy of Emmanuel with us to the Great Commission. So therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. That in this, Matthew's going to tie together that God has come with us, and he's proven that. He's in this ministry, and he says, I'm going to go with you, and you're going to go into the world. You're going to proclaim my message to these people. Matthew, I've called you to follow. Now I'm just going to send you to go do. Go and tell others of the story of redemption, of restoration, of hope and healing that they can have for their souls. And in Matthew chapter 3, the message that John preaches in the wilderness to the charge of the disciples to go out into the countryside. In Matthew chapter 10, he says, as you go, proclaim this message, the kingdom of heaven has come near. And he sends out the disciples all throughout the countryside, sharing this kingdom of heaven has come near. That is to the least of these that Jesus has come to bring his message, and he says to us, welcome to the kingdom. And I love Matthew chapter 11, is all who are weary, come find rest. welcome to the kingdom. That you're going to see a faith of a girl restored and a woman healed. You're going to see miracle after miracle of people finding rest. He says, welcome to the kingdom. And as we study through this Gospel of Matthew, what you're going to find is that this was written down so that you would know that you have a part to play in what God is doing here and now. That Jesus, through Matthew, is going to help us find our part in making our lives, our homes, our communities down here reflect the beauty of heaven up there. He's going to help us find our part to see it on earth as it is in heaven. And as we continue this series, we're going to unpack what that means for you. Like, what does it mean to be on earth as it is in heaven? What does it mean for school teacher Carly? What does it mean for retired person Dawn? What does it mean for stay-at-home Alex? What will it look like for me to make it more like heaven? And in this series, we have to answer this. To look at this incredible story and book that Matthew writes for us. And as we get in, this is how we're going to phrase on earth as it is in heaven. Very simply, making where you are more like heaven. That Matthew's life and his call and his response, he looked at his life, experiencing the mercy and salvation Jesus offered, said, here's what I can do. Here's where I can make an impact. Here's where I have influence for the sake of the kingdom. And here's where we're going to shift. Because like I said earlier, we wanted to set up that Matthew's calling and response we see modeled in him, that we want to use this now to inform what I envision for this year. Because it's one thing to say we want to be about things. It's another thing to plan for them. Alex and I last night were we're just on our phones calendaring, and we're trying to think through the year, like, hey, what do we want to be about this year? What do we want to do? Some trips we want to think about. And I think that's very wise. That's what I like about the New Year's. I never make New Year's resolutions. I hardly make goals for myself. But here's what I think is very helpful, is reflection. Reflection on, we can look back and say, hey, here's where God worked, here's how God moved, and here's where we can move forward. And as we've been praying through just kind of what this year is going to hold in 2025, and this is not, I'm not about to get into like a new year, new you, way to go. You know, I'm not about to do that. But I want to let you know that we're aiming to do more this year. Not in a sense of like more programs or all these different things, but there's a book that our staff is going through, 7 Practices of Effective Ministry, and we had a discussion on Zoom last week. And in one of the chapters we were reading had this question: what do we want people to walk away and do? And simply, like, if we don't ask this question, we can do lots of good things, but not great things. We can often lose sight of what we're trying to accomplish here, and by asking what do we want for us, it makes us answer. And you've heard us say this before, that our church, or our idea is more and better. That we want to see more and better followers of Jesus. And that's what we want to see. But the hard thing is that what we've found is it's actually very hard to measure, because it's very contingent on relational awareness, being connected to one another. And it's when we see people's next steps, or we know of them. And one of the things that I think is very helpful that Jeremy does in all of our meetings is he asks every single time, hey, where have you seen God at work in our church? Where have you seen people take steps out in faith? And it's super encouraging in church. There's a lot that you don't see. But we have our purpose here that we want to see more and better followers of Jesus. And as we're praying for this next year, but it's okay, if we want to become more and better followers of Jesus, how can we get there? And the book here described it as home plate, but if we don't see the steps, or we don't show the bases are, where's the runner supposed to go? And that led us to a little under a year ago, kind of developing a process of what we believe that we grow when we connect with God and others. That we believe we grow when we imitate the life of Jesus, and we grow when we influence those around us toward Jesus. Now, nothing, if you follow Jesus for a long time, nothing's really, like, this isn't rocket science here. It's like, but what we're going to see is that in this, some kind of connection brought you here today. Either you walk with the Lord, maybe you're visiting or whatever it may look like, that you love the Lord so you know being a part of church is important, or someone invited you. But some of us are here somehow because of a connection. That's why we put that one up there first. And when I reflect on last year, we've had many people come and connect with us. I get to reach out to people who do. And so church, you're doing a great job, because one of the things I hear all the time is that our church is very warm and welcoming. And one of the clearest ways to see a healthy church is how people connect with one another. And so church, great job with connection. But then the second thing, what does it look for our people to imitate the life of Jesus? And we do offer different things. And again, we have a simple church model, so we don't do everything, but we want to do what we do well. And so we have Sunday mornings, we have small groups starting up, as we said, but you'll see these two. Because when we're imitating the life of Jesus, we'll see these values that we want to be marked by as a people here. The idea that growing people change, that life is better connected, saved people serve people, you can't outgive God, and found people find people. And if we're to be a church marked by these values, by imitating the life of Jesus, we realize that's how we grow. And Jesus, he models for us life is better connected, that Jesus served, that Jesus gave, and Jesus called and caused people to grow. And when I think about our church, I believe a lot of us get stuck in this imitating the life part. Now, caveat, it's a lifelong process, so you're always going to be there. You're always going to be growing. If you think you're misled if you think you've arrived. But here's what I think happens a lot of times is we do believe there's this flow to it, that I connect with God and others, that I imitate the life of Jesus, and out of my love for God, because I've tasted and seen the Lord's goodness, I want others, so I'm going to use my influence. Now, here's what I think happens a lot. Maybe you'll side with me. There's a point in our minds, subconsciously, I think there's a point to when we feel equipped to do this. Think that's fair? That we feel like if we absorb more information, maybe we just take another class, maybe we just study a little bit more. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. I fear what can happen, while good intended, we get stuck here. But if we're looking at Matthew, what was his model here? He was sitting in a booth. Jesus said, "Follow me." He got up and left everything, followed him. And then what's the next thing he did? He found people. He used the influence he had. And so what I'm getting at here is that if I called you up, I don't want us to overcomplicate following Jesus. I don't want us to overcomplicate discipleship. I don't want us to overcomplicate following Jesus in this world and showing others what that looks like. Jesus, we see in Matthew that he's going to model to his disciples, hey, do these things. Disciple, love well, show others, teach them what I've commanded to you. And for a lot of us, we've been in the imitating the life of Jesus. Like, we know what the Bible says, and so we want to be able to show people. And maybe that makes you nervous to disciple somebody. And like, if I called you up and said, hey, we have someone wanting to be discipled, can you begin meeting with them? And then you're like, let me think about it. As one of your pastors, God has given you everything you need for a life of godliness. Matthew, we don't know how much time elapsed here. It was the message that Jesus showed mercy. I want others to see mercy. And so here's the cool thing, is that in this influence, you're not left alone to do it. Because you're going to see that the message is simple. Hey, Jesus changed me, he can change you. And many of those in Matthew's gospel spread that message all over the world. Through simple acts of obedience, through an unashamed witness, and I would bet by the way they interacted with one another and the way they loved one another made them stand out in a world that hasn't felt that. They just lived like Jesus together. They saw him do it. And he called them to follow. And they saw it as their responsibility to help others come to know what they know. And so as I was praying and thinking through this, what does it look like for our people to connect? Or does it look for our people to influence others towards Jesus? And this is how we see this process going. It's when you come in here, it's, well, how do I connect with God and others? How do I imitate the life of Jesus? How do I influence those around us? And then at this point, you say, okay, now how can I help others connect with God and others? How can I help others imitate the life of Jesus? Now, how can I help others influence those towards Jesus? So there's this cycle that we see, and honestly, it's dependent on you seeing it as your responsibility to use your influence to bring people with you. That you take ownership of making where you are more like heaven. That you've tasted and seen the Lord's goodness in your life, and you're like, I just can't wait to tell somebody. And as I was praying over the last couple of years, I was praying for you a couple years ago. As I was praying last year, there's one word that I kept coming back to, and this idea of taking ownership. Now, as Kristen said earlier, we use the word owner instead of member. So this is not me saying like, hey, I want to grow our membership to do the very Baptist thing of, hey, we got 600 people on our membership board, but we only got 150 people in church. Okay, that's not what I'm trying to do. But I want us to realize that members have rights, but owners have responsibilities. And we want to be very mindful this year of using our influence to see other people come to know what it looks like to follow Jesus. And on my screen, you can't see it, but I have a list of prayers on my screenshot on my iPad, my screensaver, and it has all these different prayers. And there's two things specifically that I've been praying for over this last year. This idea of taking ownership. Yes, I want people to step into seen as their responsibility to help others, but also this idea of culture of discipleship. That's what I've been praying for since I came on staff. That there's this element of once you got skin in the game, once you have tasted and seen, we owe it to one another, to our community, to the people around us, to love well, to raise up, and to disciple. To teach them, as Matthew's going to conclude this gospel, all that he's commanded us. And that's going to take some time. Cultures don't just shift over time. I mean, they shift over time. They don't just happen overnight. But I want you to join me in praying for this. Because we can't do it alone. For us, for you, the part you play in making more and better followers of Jesus here, and making our community, making our lives, making it more like heaven, is going to require all of us for this. That we can move from how can I to how can I help you. And just very closely, this is what I've been praying for too. It's just the habit of influence that we see that our lives as tools in the hands of God. That we see our workplaces, our homes, or where we go, where we shop, where we get coffee, whatever it may be. That we have a habit of influence. That we have eyes to see how God sees, and God sees people in need of hope, need of peace, and need of love. The people in our neighborhoods need the gospel. And so this is some language we use as invest, invite, and pray for. And so maybe as a habit of influence, you begin praying for people, praying for your neighbor, praying for your community. And take it one step further, invest, talk to them, hang out with them, and then invite them. And as we'll wrap up here. But I have just two questions for you. What do you want to see in your life in 2025? Or what do you want to see when you're coming standing here in 2026? What do you want to see in your church over the course of the next year? I've been praying the same thing. I don't know what guardrails you need to put in place this year. I don't know what your next step is. What if there's values maybe you need to grow and maybe you need to serve for the first time. Maybe you need to share your faith. Maybe you're growing and changing. You need discipleship. Maybe you need to grow in giving. I don't know. But I do know you need to love well. And we can only give that which we've received. So my question, are you daily embracing the love of God through his word? Have you accepted him as a savior of your life? because this allows us to extend that love to others. Because the gospel we're going to study is not merely a guide for moral living or a pathway to personal spirituality. It's a proclamation of the good news that Jesus came to save you. And that message transforms everything. That you play a part in making where you are more like heaven. And this year, I want to see your life look like that. I want to see your relationships. I want to see our church. I want to see our community. I want to see our world. I want to see Kansas City look more like heaven because of what we're doing here. And as we look back and as we are closing, Matthew, at the end of this calling, understood his responsibility to make where he was on earth as in heaven through his influence. And I can think of no greater form of influence that he wrote down this and has been influencing the church for 2,000 years. Think about it. Matthew was doing something mundane, maybe just taking notes so he didn't forget. He was doing something he was gifted in, and I'm sure he could have never fathomed that through this small step of obedience that he would have made the impact he did, and he wrote these down toward the end of his life so that his church would know, so that we would know. So never doubt or forget what God can do with your small act of obedience this year. And as we study the gospel of Matthew, we want to make heaven more, or we want to make this earth more like heaven. We want to be armed with the gospel to be able to make a difference. And church, you play a part in that. Let's pray. God, we love you and thank you for all that you do for us. And God, as we are going into this season, we're praying for more and better followers of Jesus this year. Not in the sense that we're not looking for numbers. We're not trying to just grow just the boast in it, but we want to see people's lives transformed for your glory. We want to see people armed with the gospel to love one another, to be able to pour into one another, to be able to help where needed. We want to be a church filled with people that take ownership of the growth that we see here. We want to see people empowered with the gospel to go, to invest, to invite, to pray for their coworkers, to pray for their kids, to pray for their students, to pray for their families. Yeah, but we know apart from you, it's not possible. So we ask for this upcoming year that you just move in the lives of our people, that you move and you bless our hands, you bless our endeavors, you bless what we're trying to do here. Because God, like Matthew, we want to reach our friends, we want to reach those we have influence over. So God, you move how only you can move. And I pray right now, maybe there's somebody in these people's minds that is sticking out to them. I pray that you reveal some areas that they can have influence, maybe where they already do. And that they feel encouraged and they feel empowered to go. Ask that person to coffee. Ask to hang out. Or how can I help you? But God, we don't have all the answers for what this year is going to hold, but we do know this, that you were the same yesterday, you are the same today, and you will be forevermore. So God, move in power this year. Allow us to be faithful to your word. Allow us to grow this kingdom for your glory. Amen.